My name is Mark. I work a bit in wearable sensor design, also with 360 filming, building VR experiences, augmented reality experiences. And in this workshop, I wanted to focus essentially on story structure, VR as a medium, a little bit of discussion about what it actually means. Do we actually design for something in VR? Or are we throwing technology together? And then also design approaches that we use for then making sense of different technologies that we can use for developing VR experiences. So, does everyone have like an idea of what a story actually is? Is there like a set definition for what a story is?
Yeah.
What?
Typically there's like a start setting the scene, like a peak, and then a sort of resolution style. I mean the classic type of story.
Classic, yes. Well, why do we have stories? Anyways, why do we need stories in society? What does it do for us?
Creates false news.
False news. False narratives that we can drive public opinion with.
I think it can capture the experiences in the verbal context. Stories, that's what they do. They capture the adventure, the feeling, the expressions. It's a form of art where we're trying to get an experience, expression, so sort of an archival thing. Story is also that. It's a reflection of what we as humans see around. So to share, to communicate.
But is it just communicating information?
No, it's not information as such. It has its own
Emotions.
elements which makes us different from information as such, because it is entertaining at times.
And
It
it's
has other
education.
elements.
Yeah, I pretty much think the same thing. I mean, so when I was thinking about, why do we have a structure for stories, or why do we need stories, I generally assume it to be that as a society we need to collect information that we want to transmit, but we also want to transmit emotion, or like to think that we can transmit emotion through storytelling. Because theoretically we can't really transmit emotion, even though there's some research that says possibly, when you touch each other, you can have a transmission of electrical pathways or neurotransmitters. But for the most part, the function of storytelling is to try and connect people in society. Oral storytelling is something we've been using for generations. First, it was a way to bring people together to understand our history. And now we're still using stories for basically all entertainment mediums. And the big question eventually is then, what does this actually mean for virtual reality storytelling? And what is the actual function of the story structure in that medium, if it is a medium? So for me, a lot of it has to do with the contextualizing our emotions, not just the fact that maybe I had these feelings or an experience happened to me, but trying to figure out contextualizing these events within a certain timeline. Also, if we look at research, we can conceptualize time and space as specific mediums that are not necessarily linear, but theoretically for what our experience as humans is more or less linear. You're born, things happen, you die, you pass on stories in between then. And when we talk about the shared emotion and the events that are happening, these are actually a lot of the anchors that we have in our mind. There are a few people who can supposedly remember each and every day of their lives, and they can have a nice catalog of all the events that happen in their lives, but most people can't do that. We're continually storing, restoring, copying information in our mind as our neural pathways are changing, and hopefully developing. So for me, this is one of the most important parts of the story in general: the structure, the context that it gives to our lives, and the ability that we have then to think of ourselves as a whole person, a whole being that had these experiences. Because conceptually, I think that's what a lot of people consider themselves to be. It's like the agglomeration of all the events that have occurred to them in their lives, the people that they have touched, that have touched them, and that they've had shared experiences with. And then we try to communicate that through story. So It also can give us, I would say, hope in certain situations. Because in many ways, a story isn't just recounting events and emotions, it's actually a model. If you tell me a story about your personal experience that you've had, perhaps you've had some challenge that you have to overcome in the past, this gives me information how I might approach the similar problem in my own life. In a very extreme case, if I'm watching a lot of action movies, as Americans tend to do, I might have the impression that if I'm in the Nakatomi office building and it's taken over by German terrorists, I might have the impression that I know what to do with myself, and I might know how to take control of the situation, even though in real life I have no training as a special forces soldier, haven't shot that many guns in my life, and I would probably be killed quite quickly if I tried to resist against a terrorist organization. But because I've watched Bruce Willis do this continually, because I, like many Americans, like Die Hard, I have the at least feeling that I could take control of the situation and survive, even if there's no real basis for that in reality. So stories can be, good to help us model what we can do in real life or how we think we might address certain situations. And traditionally, if we try to conceptualize it, then yes, we can come down to certain story models. If you Google story structure, you'll find, probably like 2,000 or 3,000 different variations on story structures, where we generally say, okay, something happened. Maybe there was a high energy start to the story. Then it went through a lull. Then we had specific plot points. And then we came to some resolution. And generally, this has to happen within a time frame which is, let's say, possible for people to sit through. So yes, you could tell me, if you knew everything about your life, you could recount your entire life to me, and maybe you could tell that to me over the course of an entire year, but I wouldn't necessarily have the time to listen to you for 1 year telling me about your life. And specific stories now have specific structures, and they're not just based on the fact that one story might be interesting, or one story is imparting this great feeling of emotion and information to me, but it's also completely based on the actual medium that we're using to tell the story. You can convey certain ideas in a web video of 30 seconds. You can convey a much larger, expansive story if we have a cinematic experience of 2 hours. But we can still maintain the certain specific points of the story structure, which might make it easy for me to pull in a lot of information in 30 seconds versus 3 hours. So do people have an idea of what a typical story should feel like protagonists, antagonists? Challenges.
You should also be able to connect with the characters, like a 3D, not 3D, but like a complex character. Anyway, kind of identification, I guess, with characters.
So we start to have like some specific elements that should go into this story structure. Yeah, and if we can go back to some very basic story structures, at least some of the ones we've been learning about in Western history, it's very easy to tell an action story where we have a hero, a villain, and some sort of conflict. If we do it in a sci-fi environment, we can make it, flashy, with a lot of CGI, a lot of fighting back and forth, but the actual story structure, could just be the same. Someone gets attacked by someone evil, so they have to fight against them, and that's the basic conflict. Other times, conflict could just be someone overcoming fears that they have, challenges that they have in their lives, and at some point we come to a resolution. But that resolution usually comes about because there's been some sort of transformation in the characters of the story. In virtual reality, the question then becomes, who's the audience and who's the character? Are you expecting the user of your experience to be the character in the story, Or are they more of a passive observer of the story that's occurring around them? Should they be looking and seeing the changes of the characters in the story, or should they themselves be going through a very specific character transformation due to that experience? Now, a lot of common media that we have follows the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell did a lot of research on this. He essentially created what's called the hero's journey based on a lot of research on mythology from different parts of the world. And he looked for a way to create a universal story structure. That's called the hero's journey. It follows some very specific points, and you can draw it in a circle because it includes all these elements of characters being challenged. At first, the character will say, "No, I don't really want to go on that journey." And then maybe a wizard comes along and says, "But you're the chosen one. We've chosen you to go to Mordor and destroy the Ring of Power." And he says, "Okay, I take on the responsibility." And then they go on a big journey. And then eventually there's some challenges that come about. They have to overcome them. And then in the end, Bilbo Baggins or Frodo Baggins is a changed character because they have overcome these trials and tribulations that have been thrown at them. And it's a nice model. Do people recognize this in any sort of movies that they've seen or stories that have been told to them? If you look at a lot of the movies that we're inundated with, it's absurd how many are just using the exact same story structure over and over again. And if we've been shown this medium since the time we've been born to the time that we're currently sitting in this room, probably that has had a dramatic influence on how we expect a story to be told. So if we see a movie that isn't necessarily following this story structure, it might not give us the same positive emotion. Because actually, if we have been taught that a structure should exist in the stories that are being told to us, it's not just about that single story. It's also about good emotions that we've had in the past with other stories that we've been exposed to. And we could just be trying to relive the positive emotions from, Lord of the Rings when we're watching Star Wars. And in that case, you start to question, do the characters in these stories even matter? If I look at the original Star Wars in 1977, The Force Awakens, it's basically the exact same story. Yes, there's Rey and there's Finn, and there are these new action heroes in the story. And then Han Solo comes on board, and you're like, oh, okay, it's Han Solo. It's basically the exact same story as in 1977. And when the new Star Wars comes out in December, it's all going to be about, Luke Skywalker. He's going to be the big character in the background. And yes, Rey will be there. But the question is, how is this really changing the understanding that we have of the Star Wars universe? It's still simply, essentially the exact same thing. So with regards to story structure and what are the possibilities of virtual reality, the question now becomes, are we just, expecting this type of story structure? And is this actually something that's inherently good in the way that we're telling stories? Or is it only just there because we've been taught to expect it? We've been taught to enjoy it. We've been taught that this is the way a story should be told. And for virtual reality, where we're trying to experiment with different mediums and different structures of storytelling, this can actually potentially be a very huge barrier to the way that new users and new participants in our stories are going to view them. Because they're going to say, okay, this isn't really a story I'm used to. And just viscerally, they might not get the same feeling that we would want them to get or that they might be expected to receive if they're just watching a traditional action movie. So we've talked a bit about story structure. Let's talk a little bit about how we are experiencing some of the VR experiences coming out of movies. So a few movies have been, and these have been primarily action movies, using VR experiences as part of their marketing. Suicide Squad came out last year. John Wick came out with a Steam VR game, which is essentially a first-person shooter. And then with Alien Covenant, we have this interesting VR experience where you can be the alien parasite inside a person, and then you can explode out of the person, and then you can run across the floor and infect another person by jumping in their mouth. So in each of these cases, we're essentially just trying to take one pivotal moment from the stories that were already established in those movies and relive them and experience them, which were, especially with Alien Covenant, it's not something that had ever actually been shown before in the movies. We never really got the perspective of being the alien that's being born, that's growing inside a person, and then is like trying to scrape its way out of the chest of a person. It's a bit of an experience. You can look it up, Alien Covenant VR. It's a 360 movie you can check out. And with John Wick, it's...
Where can you check it out? So,
if you just Google Alien Covenant VR, it'll come up. It's on, I believe, on YouTube. So you can view it in a normal headset and get a feeling for being an alien that was just born and is hungry to attack somebody. In Suicide Squad, where...
After breakfast.
Yeah, maybe it's something for later at the party tonight.
It's a new definition of.
Yeah, it's a new experience. I'll give them credit for that. And the other ones, you're basically just living out the action hero sense where you're shooting, you're in the middle of the action, and it's giving a sense for what it would be like in that kind of stressful situation. So instead of trying to put an entire story into the VR experience, we're just doing one succinct point in the entire arc of that original story. And this actually isn't that much different from the way that we're experiencing media normally. You might know internet memes where people just take a small snippet of a movie and replay it, or they might take a small snippet of maybe 3 to 5 minutes of their favorite TV show, they put it on YouTube. Does anyone know The Sopranos, the TV show? So The Sopranos, I think it ran for like 7 or 8 seasons. What's it about?
I don't know. I just know about the soundtrack.
Okay, it's about a mob in New Jersey, and there's all this interplay between the mob characters. I've never actually seen this series. I just watched all the highlights on YouTube, and I got a good sense, for what the dramatic pauses of the series are going to be. And I realized I didn't need to spend my time watching the entire series. I just, grabbed what other people had told me is interesting, and that still gives me probably most of the emotional impact that the rest of the series would have had if I had sat down and watched it all. But the same thing has been happening basically since the animated GIF was invented, and it became easy to remix elements from film. So if you go on Tumblr or a lot of different pages on the internet, people are just going to replay specific moments from the movie. And this is great because it's the high emotional point, or it's the high impact points of those films. So I don't have to go back and rewatch The Breakfast Club to get to the point of the movie. I don't have to rewatch Lord of the Rings to see him say, "Oh, you do not simply walk into Mordor." I can just go on the internet and I can replay those succinct, emotional, impactful pieces. But in the back of my mind, I still have the entire story structure of that experience. I just want to relive those key emotions. And so for VR, it's a very natural way to integrate that into the greater story structure. And 5 years ago, this would have been called transmedia storytelling, where we have one initial media, for example, a movie, and then we play out a game. We have additional novels, for example. We have TV shows, we have toys, so we can model, so we can play with the idea of the original material and allow it to seep into all the different parts of our creative life. So we talked a little bit about character, storytelling, having a need for characters to change in order for a story to be a story. So now one of the things is, it's not just about the characters, it's also about, as you mentioned, the setting. And in virtual reality, it's the world building, which actually is actually really the largest part of the medium. As was discussed in the language of VR, the idea of proximity, the idea of how we can create the world around the user is actually one of the points where we have the most creative control. So we talked about the generic story. Character has to overcome challenges. Doesn't matter if it's, Pac-Man has to eat a lot of things, or a character has to transform in order to save the universe. But if a character is transforming through a conflict, there's a question of where the conflict arises from. Could be interaction between different characters. If you're doing a narrative-driven, if you're doing something like Seinfeld, for example, it was a TV show from America, which basically took place in a New York apartment, and everything was just interaction between the users, between the actors, and they didn't have to go to expansive locations outside. It was all just about. It was a show about nothing, just about people hanging out essentially. But in movies and a lot of different media, when we start to set the environment, which we can do quite easily in a VR story, we can start to create a differentiation between a story which is driven more by character development or driven more by the world. So if we're designing the world in a certain way, allowing people to interact with it in a certain way, this is a very succinct way in VR that we can affect them, that we can direct them in a certain pathway, or allow them to explore the world in a certain way. And that's a key differentiator from the traditional media like film, where it has to be a passive experience and we just view what's happening. World building is actually really more coming from game development, where in 3D games, if you're building games in Unity or Unreal Engine, you do actually have to physically build the world for the characters. You have to build the levels of Doom. You have to build that physical environment. You can allow it to have physics like we have in the normal world. You can allow it to have physics like you would have on Mars. But you define how the characters can move in that world. And there's really great examples for this, especially when it comes to a lot of the superhero movies that have been coming out recently, because superhero movies are all about origin stories, primarily. Yeah, and it's usually an interesting origin story, and then it's a boring series of films where, there's people just like fighting each other, like in Civil War. And many times with traditional superhero movies, there isn't really that much character development. Thor is the same person he was in the first film as in the second film. There's been, I think, 3 Iron Man films, plus like Civil War, plus I think he's in Spider-Man now. Tony Stark is still arrogant, and yeah, there was that time when he lost his Iron Man suit and he had to like redeem himself. But overall, he doesn't really change that much as a character, because we just go to see these films to see action heroes, to see the action hero trope. It's been starting to change a little bit, especially with DC movies, like Superman. The Watchmen was a really great graphic novel turned into a great movie, where the superhero characters then really start to question themselves. Why am I doing this? The Superman film, it's really a lot more about if we have weapons of mass destruction, which is what the superheroes represent. How do these get integrated into society? How do we view them as components of society? So we're starting to, in some ways, bring in a more realistic view of like what we would consider magic if we think about the hero's journey. And this is good because it allows us to see characters not just as heroes. And if you think about the definition of a hero is supposed to be somewhere between a person and a god, right? A normal person would never attain the powers of a god, but they might become a hero where they can overtake some of the magic and abilities of a god. And in many ways, if you think about this, if we've been taught that same secular story from the time we've been born, more or less, then it's actually quite natural for us to not want to be overachievers because, we haven't been chosen yet. There hasn't been a wizard who's come to us and said, you're special, you're going to do great things in life, so now I'm going to give you this magic ring and you're going to disappear and you're going to do great things. And this is one thing that I think I'd really like to see changing in the VR storytelling environment, to break away from the traditional story structures that we've essentially been indoctrinated with for generations and generations. So when we think about world, we think about presenting challenges to the user, which they then naturally have to overcome in order to progress in the storyline. And this can be something as easy as the origin, could be as simple as logistics, how they get around in the world. And it then becomes very logical if we use design tools like a user experience map or a character journey map to first build the world environment and then logically understand what the character would have to do in that world in order to survive, in order to progress in the story that world has presented to us. And this can then help to define different character traits. So it's a very natural way that we can create character traits by first starting from the world development, as opposed to first writing a character and then putting them into a specific situation. So character journeys and things like user experience journey maps, they're basically the same thing. It's just one was originally used for developing web pages, one was originally used for more narrative-based work. And you can start out by just logically laying out what's going to happen to the character. These can integrate with the plot points if you've developed a more traditional story script beforehand. And it's a nice way to allow integration between story structure and the character development, which would then ultimately come into your VR experience. And then the next step beyond that is starting to do actual storyboarding of specific scenes. These were created in Unity for a project I was working on, where we essentially had a computer-generated desert environment, and then we had animals moving around that were trying to...
So may I just ask you, why did you choose to use Unity as opposed to Unreal when the seat time in Unreal is free and Unity isn't?
Well, I think right now Unreal and Unity are pretty much on the same level as in terms of accessibility and freeness, let's say. I still like using Unity for a lot of things, mainly because there's so many plugins available for it. So from the Unity Asset Store, you can very easily buy a universe, and you can start to build a literal universe for $60. Also, pretty much anything that comes out, whether it's a controller or a different SDK, definitely they will have a Unity SDK. Probably they will have Unreal Engine as well, but it's not always guaranteed. At the end of the day, they're both using C, C# for programming. So if you're doing some programming as part of the project, you should be able to work within Unity or Unreal Engine. Yeah, so like for example, here we're prototyping in Unity, building a 3D world, and this is one of the really powerful things of a gaming engine like this, because you can physically build a world relatively quickly. You literally just, you can paint trees and you can paint contours, and you could create the map from The Hobbit, for example, in probably about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how detailed you want to make it. And then you can very logically have an idea for how people or worlds are going to exist within that environment that you've built. And you can also very easily export 360-degree images directly from Unity using the proper plugins.
Oh, okay, so you do all the look around and you pull it
Yeah.
up. Okay.
So, this is primarily just as a development tool, but Unity is also becoming much and much more interesting as a cinematic creation tool. So, because you can animate cameras in Unity, You can create stereoscopic output for true stereoscopic view. You can create monoscopic 360-degree images or video, also at 60 frames per second, and it's just rendering it from the 3D environment. So it can be very flexible for doing this sort of development and actual movie production. So once we're then laying out our scenes, whether we're thinking about a gaming experience or we're thinking about a movie experience, a 360-degree production, we can then break down the specific scenes that we would want to move between. And then we can start to logically lay out the chronological order of how our experience or our movie or our story is going to be for the user. And just as we were borrowing from film before or from gaming, storyboarding has always been a powerful tool. Despite all of the CGI and computer graphics animations that we have, we still love to use traditional storyboarding, sketching out ideas, filling in those ideas, and then passing those ideas from production to 3D asset creation, for example, and then planning out the scene, planning out the pre-production, and the actual production that we would need for our experience. Now, just as a, yes?
How do you plan your storyboarding in a 360 environment? Because there's cuts on camera cuts
Yeah.
who can work in cinematics and classical cinematics in video games or
Mm-hmm.
in film. But there's this scene, for example, so you can look around. How do you plan to have?
So you can do a combination of a traditional storyboard, and you can also do, I didn't show an image here, but you can lay out the view of the story from above.
A top-down version?
Yeah, so for example, if I was in Unity and I built this little world, I could also just reorient the camera direction to be looking down on my world above. And then I could have the perspective of the user in the center. And then I could logically lay out, I need an audio source back here, or I'm going to have a camera, I'm going to have the camera stationary, I'm going to have this character move in from the side. It really depends on what stage of production you're in. If you're in the initial concept stage, or you're getting to the stage where you're bringing in multiple elements of interactivity and trying to understand if that's going to confuse the viewer or if that's going to add to the story. So there's different tools that we can use, and the point is to be flexible and modify to the production process that you have, because that's the most important thing, that you're using communication tools, whether it's scripting, storyboarding, character journeys, that are going to allow you to communicate effectively within your team or within your production environment. And a very good example of combining a lot of the concepting with world building, if you look up Alex McDowell, he's like the leader in world building in Hollywood. He gave a really great talk in Lausanne in 2013. He talked about world building, and Superman was a really great example of this, because if you look at the genesis that they went through in creating the world for Superman, it's very intricate. They started with his S, which stands for hope in the Kryptonian language. And they went through a lot of different variations to understand from a biomimicry standpoint how that S should look. And then they started to create glyphs for the general language of Krypton. And then they started to create the world of Krypton. And the genesis story is essentially that they mined out their world. The world is collapsing. This sets up the reason for why Superman needs to fly off to Earth and why General Zod needs to chase after him. Saying it's a complete genesis story, which can really be, that starts from a very simple concept, but it can lead then to the entire progression of the movie. If we go into some, let's say there's a book that just came out called, or not just, I think it was about a year ago, Lincoln and the Bardo. This is literature. This is an actual book, nothing about movies or anything. It's a story about Abraham Lincoln, who's the president of the United States, and his son had died. My colleague Caitlin Krause, who also does a lot of research in VR and education, likes to use this as an interesting example of how we're translating from one medium, which is true literature, to a VR medium. And you can go on the New York Times YouTube channel. If you look up Lincoln in the Bardo VR, you can view it. And essentially what happens is that we set the stage of a graveyard. When the scene opens, you're in the center of this graveyard. There are ghosts that come up to you, and they start talking about their lives. They are essentially coming from the American Civil War. There are people that have died there. And they're giving bits of their, not necessarily stories, but some of them are like yelling at you and giving bits of their lives. And at first, when you start the story, you think actually that you're Lincoln, or at least that was my impression. I thought I was supposed to be that character. And then as these ghosts are moving around me, then Lincoln eventually, he walks in from the back, and then he goes in to the crypt where his son had died and he was buried in the crypt. And then he goes in and then he embraces him, he carries him out. And so it's a very emotional VR piece, and it's based off of, it's a direct translation from literature to a VR environment. So it's very interesting to look at this and get an impression for how we translate from one medium to the other, and they still try to have a story structure within that experience.
And did you read the book first and then watch this?
So that's the thing, I've never read the book. I just went to the VR experience because the point is, what can we actually glean just from the VR experience? Do you have to read the initial source medium to really understand it? And in this case, it's also somehow a bit distracting because we talked about some of the VR language last time in the previous talk. And we were just discussing things about, how should I plan for something to come in from the side or have a voice from behind? And this is something I find almost comically distracting, unfortunately, about the piece, because sometimes they have a ghost. She has other ghost heads around her and she's like swatting them. But the way that the movement of the heads is, it feels very comical. It feels almost like it's hard to describe, but it kind of made me laugh when I was viewing it instead of being, immersed in the story. So it's also a good example for how you have a very interesting, very truthful source material that can somehow, I don't want to say be cheapened, but it's distracting if you don't have an experience which is actually true to the source material. Because essentially they shot a lot of people on green screen, and you get a sense actually that it's more like theater, like the way that people deliver lines. It's in a very similar way that you would see if they were on stage. So I'm going to go through now a bit of, we've talked about VR as a medium. No one has actually really defined what that is. Even in the last talk, we said, there's a lot of different technologies in VR. How do we put them into an experience? And should we put all these technologies into an experience? We can think about the Wizard of Oz. This is a great analogy because in the story of the Wizard of Oz, we eventually come to the end of the story with Oz. Oz appears to be a giant monster who's ruling over the city of Oz. And then a little bit later, we realize Oz is really nothing more but it's actually a VR experience. He's just projecting a ghost in order to try and scare the people into submission. And he's really just a little cute professor who is using technology in order to try and suppress people. And we've been trying to do VR for literally decades now. We've had in the 1990s, but even back into 1957, 1965, we've been trying to use virtual reality, develop it to a point where it can be used as a normal communications medium. But if you look at all these different experiences, there isn't actually one necessarily cohesive line between these. They're all kind of used for different purposes. And so when I was originally working with transmedia storytelling, I was trying to make sense of how to make sense of complicated story structures. And I said, okay, if we have to have story structure and we're going to have a way that people are going to view or consume media, let's just break it down to the simplest view possible. We have content, let's say it's a book, movie, literature, whatever. Somehow we have to have a container. There has to be a way for people to either hold it as a book or have a tangible or virtual tangible thing that they can hold, that they know that this content is inside, like a video player. And then there has to be a way that people are consuming it. And we were doing this originally because with a transmedia storytelling experience, you might have a game plus a mobile app plus a book creating a story universe that people could then get into. But the most important thing is the audience and how the audience is really going to view that story based on the technology that's being used. So traditionally, I don't really consider VR to be a medium yet. A big reason for this is that there's so much sprawl in what can actually be used to create a VR experience. When I think about a medium for entertainment or for communication, I don't just think about the core technology components that are being used to create it. I'm thinking about the actual expectations of the audience. And this is one of the biggest barriers that we have for VR at the moment. If we think about these ways of communicating entertainment right now, we have theater. Theater has been around for thousands of years. We modified it a bit with cinema, so that now we have a moving picture instead of a live action performance. But theater still exists all over the world. It hasn't been replaced. And then if we move on to something like television, you think, well, it's still a moving picture. But actually, there are huge differences between not just the way that stories are told in these different areas, but also the expectation of the audience when they move into that area. One easy, maybe it's sort of a cheap example, but Joshua Bell, he was a world-class violinist. He was, there was a social experiment where he was in a metro station performing beautiful pieces of music by Bach on a Stradivarius, like a $3 million violin. And then people are just walking by. They're not stopping to listen to the beautiful music. But, and some people would say, well, this is because we don't appreciate culture, we don't appreciate music, blah, 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 blah. But realistically, they weren't expecting that. That's not what they were looking for. They were trying to get from point A to point B, and they're not going to have time necessarily just to say, there is a world-class violinist. Allow me to take 30 minutes out of my time, out of my day to listen to you.
I think space affords interaction. So that is not the space for that particular interaction, and that's why it's out of place. So people are not modeled to behave in certain fashion.
Exactly.
The other spaces, it's the predefined interaction that they are supposed to have, the expectation. So I think that's the one.
And what is your expectation when you go into a VR experience?
Something that it'll be 3D, it'll be immersive, and you'll not get nausea.
Does it have to be 3D?
No, but most of the time when you think of VR, you think that it'll be a world in 3D, though it might be in 2D, and it can still work well. And the other thing would be that, it'll be magical or fantasy.
So let's take a step back and talk about film again for a second. Film is a really good, interesting analogy for VR, because if you think about it, it's taken a really long time to get to the point where we think of film in a certain way. Film was originally silent film, and it had a variety of frame rates. So if you think about the way that we view the world, with our eyes, if you're viewing something at about 60 frames per second or more, it's going to be fluid. If it's less than that, you might be able to discern some sort of movement in between frames. And for sure, if you're viewing something at 16 frames per second, you're going to be seeing some sort of flicker. So when they started to introduce sound, there were a few technical limitations. They had to synchronize sound to the film that was being captured, but they also had some financial constraints. Film is expensive. So if you're able to save money by shooting at 24 frames per second instead of 50 frames per second, that can be a huge production savings, just as it is today. So we came down to 24 frames per second, somewhere in the range of 1927. And then up until now, we've been viewing cinema always at 24 frames per second. People call it the cinematic look, because it's a little bit slower than reality. And when we watched then, when video came out, and when we started having productions on television, which is shown at, it could be interlaced 50 frames per second, or it could be 30 frames per second, depending on where you are in the world, people would say, okay, this is different than cinema. It's a little bit more fluid, and you can automatically see the difference in medium. And also, TV was basically considered cheaper. It was like a free medium. You're not paying for it like you would for cinema. And so then in like 2012, there are a lot of forward-thinking directors like Peter Jackson who said, we want a higher frames per second because that's going to give us a more immersive, sharper image on 3D film. And it's true. The Hobbit in 48 frames per second is more immersive and it's awesome. But the majority of people were like, no, this isn't cinematic. This is too fluid. The image is too sharp. And you're thinking, what? Like it's cooler. It's more immersive. But there was so much pushback from it that 48 frames per second is basically dead right now. It might come back in Avatar with James Cameron, hopefully. But it was a really good example of how there's just like so much pushback from people because they're getting something different than what they expected. And it's a really simple difference, actually, 24 to 48 frames per second. But it had a big pushback. And right now, if we think about VR, 60 frames per second is basically the normal for gaming. And 4K per eye is what we're looking for with stereo or for monoscopic film.
So this leads on to another area where for a decade we've been playing with, but buffering and Wi-Fi and delivery and quality.
Yeah, that's from the experience viewpoint, 60 frames per second is great, but I mean you can't even play that on YouTube.
Exactly.
And if you have like a 5-minute film at 60 frames per second, 4K, that's like what, 1.5 gigabytes? So it's also really hard to actually package into an application that people can download easily. So again, we're going to have problems with getting that nice medium between good experience and technical feasibility. And it's still open with VR, that's the thing. So now we're going to talk a bit quickly, I'd say, about immersive design. So actually we have story structure, we have the medium, audience expectations, and now how do we go about doing design? So we take the best of all the different worlds that we've learned from. Film, theater, we have story structure, we have intention of the director. From user experience design, which is originally coming from web and mobile products, we have interaction design, so understanding what technologies to apply to achieve the experience that we want for the user. And then from game design, we have the things like world building, game engines, the ability to program and interact with, or to program that interactivity that we need to tell the story that we want to give people. A lot of the problems that we then run into is user experience, because we've been taught very well for the past 20 years how to interact with computers. It's been primarily through a keyboard and mouse. At the same time, we've been moving towards a world where we started out by talking to each other, we started writing letters, talking on the telephone, and nowadays, people just text. We have essentially a lot of devices that move towards micro interactions instead of what we would consider to be long-form communication. So we go from computers to laptops, pinching and zooming on mobile devices. But now if you look at this, the HTC Vive in the middle is actually a bit of an anomaly because we want people now to stop doing micro interactions and go directly into a immersive, completely enclosed environment. And in many ways, this is somehow counter to the way that technology has been developing in terms of communication and in terms of the way that we interact with computers as a society. And this is the main design barrier that I see when it comes to designing for VR experiences. Because I think if I ask everyone in the room, there's going to be a lot of different responses to what they believe a VR experience should be. Your expectations are probably going to vary a bit. They're going to vary because you've had different experiences with different devices. And there's still a big sprawl of devices that we can use. There isn't a specific VR experience that we can point to. I can have a mobile device where I just have head tracking. I can have an HTC Vive where I can move around through teleportation. I can have a mobile device where I can look down and then I will automatically move forward just by programming it that way. But there isn't one succinct virtual reality experience that I can design for and have an expectation that a new user will know how to use that technology 5 seconds after they put the headset on. So we always have to essentially teach users in the first part of our experience how to interact with the world and how they should experience it. Now this will change over time, but we're still in a stage where the term immersive environment, it doesn't have to just be a virtual reality. It can be augmented reality. It can be projection mapping. It's up to us to design what we want for the experience that we want to provide to the audience, especially when it comes to theater and film. We can do projection mapping within a space and allow this to interact with the actors or with the audience. So when we start out with the design of these experiences, usually start out from a very high level to say this is going to be a more passive experience or this is going to be a more interactive experience. Because this helps to dictate what's going to be required from production as well as what's going to be required from the user. So a lot of experiences that we see here, they're actually more of a simulation. So when we think about story structure, even with the examples that we've seen before, it's really about presenting the user to an environment and allowing them to interact with that environment. But it's not necessarily allowing them to change that environment or dramatically change themselves due to the experience. And this, I think, is what a lot of people are going to expect in the future. So we can easily take a very succinct simulation, whether it's being a first-person shooter in John Wick or going into a spy car and living in that small volume. And as we're able to design, make a decision that we're going to have more of a sitting experience or more of a standing room experience, that's also going to impact quite a well which users can actually use our devices. You have the Windows-based Acer device coming out, which is essentially a VR goggle, but it's going to be a sitting experience from what we've seen. And then in the design process, we already know what's comfortable for users in terms of moving forward or backward. There's been a lot of research done by Samsung, for example, to say that a user should only move up or down or right or left a certain amount. So we should also use these guidelines when we're designing our experiences, because this is directly going to the comfort of the user. You don't want to necessarily make a user move too much if they don't have to, because it becomes distracting and it can also just be physically tiring. I don't want to be pulled or pushed one way or another unless I decide that I want to do this. So when we then start to make sense of the technologies, we can look at user flow, the story structure that we've discussed before, and then come down to interactivity and deciding if we're using technologies better for VR or AR or mixed reality. The specific technology mediums broken down by like theater, game design, user experience that we can use, it's very, let's say, easy to list out. And then we can start to make circles around the elements that we're going to need for our design. And then we can design a production schedule, design a production plan for how to go forward. There's more and more VR creation capabilities coming out all the time. from 360 films to volumetric capture, volumetric video. But it's important to understand, the basic design process. We concept, we do our story or script, and then we go through the interaction design process, we build and test, and then we go back and make sure that people are actually understanding what we were doing and that they actually are finding some value in it. So we can use this direct interaction design process for building complex or simple immersive experiences.